Hey folks, welcome back. Really got an interesting conversation to share with you this time. This is with Morgan, who joined us in Denver at the Micro Solidarity Gathering we did a couple of months ago. So it's a bit of a late conversation, but it's interesting because Morgan was showing up with some feedback basically about how we could do things differently next time. And I thought it was really, I thought they were very careful about how to bring that feedback in a way that I could hear it. And I felt like I learned a lot. And so, yeah, happy to share it. And hopefully you learn something too. If you're interested in Morgan's work, I'm going to include a link because they're doing some really interesting stuff around like trauma-informed facilitation and movement practices. And yeah, I think they've got a really rad body of practices and knowledge. So I'm going to add a link in the description so you can follow up with what they're doing. Okay, enjoy the conversation.
What about now?
Yeah, we've got you.
Yay, cool. Get my video back too. Yeah, so I mean, I only have like Denver as a point of reference for you. Like, I would love to know like what other projects are alive for you, so that I can also think like a little bit more expansively about like the downloads that I wanted to share with you and thinking about like what the ripple effects of them would be rather than being like isolated just Denver kind of vibe.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think that's a context I would appreciate.
Yeah, cool. So what's alive for me is I've been currently thinking about it as there's kind of like two big currents, and one is and ideally I'd love it if these two things were completely integrated and there was no tension between them. But at the moment it feels like they're like parallel tracks rather than one. One is that the work I do for money, and that's very satisfying and meaningful, but it's not always the thing that I would most want to be doing when I wake up in the morning. And that's
Mm,
supporting organizations to be less hierarchical, more collaborative, more decentralized. Mostly working with organizations that already have a pretty flat structure. A lot of cooperatives and more self-managing teams deal with conflict and decision-making protocols and weird power dynamics. And how do we initiate a culture of care and like personal development, co-development? How are we being effective in a way that's like restoring people and not just like burning them out and treating them like disposable resources?
mhm,
So that's all good stuff, and it shows up as a lot of like we run online courses and trainings and some more like sort of deeper, more engaged consulting projects with specific organizations. So spending 6 months with them or a year with them and helping them along a path of like basically trying to get them into the habit of continuous improvement. So they're learning how they don't need external support. They've got all the resources they need. They just have to get that habit of reflection and experimentation going, and how do they change their relationships. So all this stuff, really stuff that I love to do.
mhm.
But I just have a thing that when someone's paying me to do a job, um, somehow becomes slightly less fun than if I was doing it for free. So that's one track, and that's all organizational.
Okay.
And then the other track, I just think about it, especially like organizations and then communities. And the community thing, it's so far it hasn't really been. It's not like a big profit-making enterprise, um, super satisfying and fun to. So this is the micro solidarity stuff. Like, basically, that looks like sharing some skills, but more it's actually about creating connections, generative connections between people rather than showing up with something that they didn't have already. There's a little bit, I think there's a little bit of frameworks and ways of thinking that we bring, but mostly it's just the generative bumping into each other thing that I love. And now I think where I'm at with micro solidarity is just after that gathering we did where we met together in Denver, like feels like there's enough ripeness and enthusiasm and energy and excitement for people that have been participating in the network more or less over the last, it's like been gradually quietly developing over the last couple of years, but now it just suddenly seems like there's enough people that care enough that they want to step up in some kind of voluntary role to take responsibility for some part of the system. And so now it feels like my role is to get my vision out, have that vision really interrogated and pulled to pieces, and go like, what part here is something precious and useful, and what part is just like weird hangups and biases and not relevant, or doing all of that thing. And how can I basically fan the flames of people's enthusiasm, create just a minimum level of coordination between, I'm imagining, there's going to be, ideally there'll be like 5, 6, 7 different work groups form over the next year or so, and I just kind of help coordinate between them and help them become a super organism that's not going in kind of vaguely one direction, not all pulling off in different ones. So that's the stuff that really gets me excited in the morning. That's the thing that I'm like, just want to find any free moment I've got to go and help that thing along. It's like I feel like a doula maybe, or a midwife. Just really just want to help this birth along. And I've got a vision of who it's going to grow into, with what this super organism wants to be. And it's kind of like impatient now. Is that what you're looking for? Is there more gaps that I can fill in?
I guess maybe with the organizational consulting that you're doing, like this doesn't have to be like a long about it, but just like a little snippet of kind of like, what are they up to? Like, what are their industry? Like, what are their missions? Like, what are you, what's their,
I mean,
purpose on this planet kind of vibe.
For me, it's always been important, and you would have got a flavor for this as well in Denver. Like, it's quite important for me to be connecting with people who wouldn't normally talk to each other. So it's not a really narrow band, but probably the majority of them would be working in European NGOs of different kinds. So Nathy's just come back from doing a job with a coalition of digital rights activists who are trying to decolonize the field of digital rights. And so they're like trying to get all these different organizations, some of whom are like kind of old and, more conservative, and some of them are brand new that have got like a really up-to-date framing around decolonization, trying to get them up to a shared understanding and how does that actually influence how we're lobbying for different policies in the EU. So there's that kind of thing. Some of the ones that I feel the most close to are like technology cooperatives, just small groups at 15, 20 people, where it's a bunch of programmers that just want to like not have bosses and do good work. And that some of them will be anarchists, but some of them are just like not particularly political. They just want to have a nice life and they don't want to deal with hierarchy. Those are really my people. And like, this one in Turkey I mentioned, it's a big design agency that's like trying to, like they're the more sort of, they have the most in common with more traditional corporate structures, but they're really trying to do something different. They've come from a place of a traditional hierarchy, and they're really trying to get to something that's more self-managing, more empowered, less hierarchical. So there's kind of a smattering. I think as a rule, it's like everyone must be working on something that I consider to be meaningful and purposeful, and it's quite a broad remit underneath that.
Cool, thank you for sharing.
I mean, I love talking about myself, Morgan, so.
At least you're honest about it.
Yeah.
At least you're honest about it, dude.
You said you had downloads, and I use that word in 2 different ways. One is like when I enter party consciousness and I'm on the dance floor and suddenly have this sense of like accessing some kind of divine consciousness or something that gets downloaded into me, like, oh, I see it. And then the other one is like more a way of talking that I get into sometimes, which is like info dumping. Like, these are I'm so excited to tell you about all these things that I know. And I wondered if download means one or both or something else for you.
I'd say the commonality between like what a download is for me is like a point of clarity, like a very like you know, when you're like the file came like, like
Transmission complete.
yeah, and I think well, what I do know actually is that like some of them happened during the time in Denver, and like we just never got the time to sit down, and so like some of it is like very Denver contextual, and then like with the imagination of from each of these points of downloads, and they're also downloads in the sense of like cultural exchange too, because in some ways I think what I perceive that we have in common is that we love facilitating, and we love being able to like bring the most synergistic power of a collective into co-creation. And I think that like the cool part is that we've just done it in really different contexts. And so I was just like stoked to be in a space with people that are like thinking at the speed and with the like multi points of input, you know, and you're gathering from your wisdom. I'm gathering from mine and all of my teachers, and you know, all your teachers are present, and all your ancestors are present, all my ancestors are present, etc. And it just felt like a cool opportunity where I'm like, oh, I would love to jam with somebody that likes to vibe at this level of like, you know, nuance and intelligence and like creative push. Like you have a type of drive that I feel in myself too, that, you know, doesn't always get mirrored. And so when I like saw that in you and also imagining it in your team, like granted we got like a piece of your team, I was just like, could it be like to put some like ideas in the pot and see if there's something you're already chewing on, and how are you chewing on it, or like if you're not chewing on it, like what could it be like to put it into the collective mind of what the hum's up to, based off of like the baseline like, you know, like the realness of the feedback that I gave you, that you were like, this is like the fucking coolest compliment that I could get. Because that was the essence of what I pulled for whatever may have been like a question in my mind of like, hey, why wasn't this present at the weekend? Or like, could have this been incorporated, or et cetera, et cetera. Like that's what I came away with, was the feedback that I gave you. And so if anything I say today is like, it's in addition to, and like curiosities on how it could be added in. Not from being like, I think like Rich is totally whack and off point, like, you know, nothing like that. And it was, you know, I noticed myself having a conversation with C too that weekend, recognizing and seeing in the you know, group of folks that showed up, I like a relational thirst, that I recognized. I was like, whoa, I'm showing up here like so bountiful in like relational practice, and relational resources. And if, you know, if we were thinking about us as like, you know, literally bringing like food from the crops that we get to like harvest from in our communities, like our crew from the Pacific Northwest, like we were coming with our fucking arms full. And it was a little bit interesting to try to figure out like where to put that kind of bounty. And yeah, so I was like reflecting to see about that. I was like, wow, this is like really like is an interesting thing. I thought I was gonna come to get fed, but then I was like, whoa, wait a second. No, like we got like crops, like our land is fertile, like our relationships are really fertile. And so yeah. So the downloads that I have are like coming from that place. And hopefully like some facilitation, either like thoughts or approaches that I feel like could be like augments to what y'all are up to, but also like planting seeds of like, what does it look like for future collaboration? So.
I know that one thing I'd love to hear from you is like basically feedback in the form of like, if I were doing this is what I would do differently.
I'm sorry?
If like, I'd love to hear from you, like if I were going to be running gatherings like this is how I'd do it differently, or like this is the thing that I would usually bring that I would have loved it if I'd seen you do it, or something like that. Like in that, because I knew that there's I mean I come with my own projections. I assume that there's a kind of like a bunch of signals and scripts and like social codes that are expected in a gathering of more progressive people, and it just didn't do any of them. And that was a like provocative thing to not do. And so I'd love to know, yeah, what you would have done in my seat.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. Well, cool. Thank you for giving me that permission. I appreciate it.
And
And I'm
the
also
specifics there is like, if you say, this is how I would have done it, then I can hear it. But if you say you should have done it this way, then I'll shut down.
gotcha. Prime.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. I'm reframing it into that way that you're asking for feedback, which I rarely get that kind of permission. So cool. Yeah. So, something that I'm really trying to tune into, especially because of like my own positionality as a white person in the United States, and like the responsibility of what it means to be a settler, and having carried like the lineage of a colonialistic ancestry, and something that's been asked of me too is to make sure that when we land, like we acknowledge the land, and that we like land in the history of the place that we are in, particularly for coming from lots of different places. So a thing that I would have done as a facilitator is to make sure that we're like naming the original peoples of the place where we're practicing, and highlighting some of their skills that could still be and still are like alive because of us showing up to that land. Like that land has something to teach us, and to gift us, and like how we relate with each other. So I would have taken time to cultivate that into like an opening or into a conversation, or to an invitation to do a little research on somebody's break on like, hey, get to know the people who originally lived here, and use this land for sacred reasons.
And what does that do you think? Like, what job is that doing in the group?
That job is helping us remember that we're part of a historical trajectory. It helps us remember that we are inherently resourcing from the ecology around us. And it can also be a really key reminder as to like the historical trauma that like by working collectively, we're healing in a way. Yeah.
I'm just taking notes. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is like, I guess there's a point. I just feel basically ignorant of what's a good way of doing things. Like I've as an international person, like that's not all from that part of the world, I've kind of heard land acknowledgements before that felt like it wasn't obvious what they were doing,
They can be really shitty. They can be really shitty and performative.
Yeah.
And
I had one, I was invited to one gathering that started with quite a lot of, like there was a whole piece that was led by one of the Indigenous elders, and like where they really obviously put a lot of effort into centering indigeneity, and it was kind of a disaster.
Oh.
So I haven't had an experience yet of what's a good example to copy, or like where to take inspiration from, or anything like that. So sounds like you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And at minimum too, that's also kind of like the sister step of that is to remind us that like we're bringing our ancestry into this space just because we've got them in our DNA, like the shadow parts, the strengths, the resilience, the lessons. Like it's also a way for us to remember like our wholeness as we're collaborating, our limitations and our strengths. Yeah, so it's like historically landing us, like we are not independent from this land, the violence and the beauty that it holds. Like we're only here because we're breathing the air of the plants around us that have like seen both ecological harm and also human harm and animal harm. Both like also have like figured out how to keep growing despite all that shit.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing, I had a little conversation with Abby about this, and I shared, yeah, basically I was like, yeah, I know I'm ignorant of like what's a good way of doing this. And the kind of conclusion of that conversation was, one thing I could have done was explain what I know about how to walk in integrity with the indigenous people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I'm from, and say like, if we were in New Zealand, this is how I would have, this is how we would do that. And at least it's like, that's the situate, like, at least here's my lineage, you know, it's like kind of from, it's like adjacent and it's related but different context. And then like you said, I really like what you said, just like someone could do some research like during the time. It's not like everything has to be perfectly controlled ahead of time, but that's something that we could have really called in.
Yeah, and you could resource too from the crowd.
Yeah.
You know, like just by naming ancestry, you're like, hey, come on in. Like you all got some lit lineages.
Yeah.
And also let's like explore the lineage of this space.
Yeah.
Then you kind of like plant some roots.
Yeah, nice.
You know, then like for sure me and Aloe, and I hope we'll have a handful of other folks who've been like, we got you.
Yeah.
You know, like you don't have to hold it.
Yeah, that's great.
You're like,
that's
I know
really
there's
great.
this thing. I know there's this
In
thing.
a way, I feel like there was an almost microscopic version of that, which was Mars as kind of one of the representatives of the most recent host of that land, taking us around and being like, these are the artists that inspire our community, and like this is how they've worked on the land, and these are the stories, and it's just like doing that, but connecting to a much bigger scope, and just rolling it back a bit further would have been just the thing. Yeah, cool.
Because you're the visionary too that's rolling us forward. Like you're intuitively responding to the harm of colonialism by creating microsolidarity. And just being explicit about that.
Yeah.
Like these past. Go ahead.
I think without this kind of acknowledgement of history in place, it feels like we're kind of pretending like we're nowhere. You know, it's kind of like we're in no place in no time. We're just in an Airbnb. We're just in a random like decoupled bubble. Say no, the bubble is held by more bubbles.
Bingo.
Yeah, cool.
Bingo. Yeah, and I think the other thing that you know, and you mentioned earlier this morning, and like there's some shit that I just chose not to do. So this may be one of those things. But something that limited my ability to engage, and that what I have done as a facilitator is like spent more time developing group agreements around how to navigate sharing space with each other, how we mutually set boundaries. What I felt and watched in your body is that you took on a shit ton of responsibility, Rich, as like at the individual point person of you're like, I got boundaries, you let me know if anything happens. That's a lot to hold in a crew. Like, especially with that many like dynamic, wildly different psychologied people. And to have spent some time on like what we need to be able to show up well, and have everybody have a time to be able to name that and post that somewhere. Like these are our needs to be able to show up well with each other. Now, like my facilitation spaces are explicitly more often than not teaching about what are trauma sensitive relationships and how do we go about them like explicitly in an anti-oppressive way. And there may be some differences here on like what my hat typically is versus yours. But when I have my hat on as a facilitator, we are like surfacing how power dynamics play between bodies from the get. And how if we are gathering with the explicit purpose of being able to, you know, center equitably sharing resources and being bountiful and not limiting, then we need to be really mindful about how easy it is for us to take up space based off of how protected we've been from systems of oppression. And like how many beats do we need to take, especially if we're sitting in one of those like really protected positions, to like step back, breathe a bit, give spaciousness for voices that take a little bit longer to surface because they're having to like push through all of those moments in which they haven't been held well in spaces. to be able to like participate. Um, whether that's because of introversion, whether that's because of trauma survivorship, whether that's because of X, Y, and Z. Um, and then mixed, so then we all just like know what our needs are from the get, rather than having to surface because a need didn't get met or a boundary got crossed. It's like, oh no, these are my boundaries from the beginning. These are my needs from the beginning. And then also like the brilliance of Andy at the end, who's like, wait, I like kind of have seen like 3 themes of why people showed up. And if we had known that from the beginning, like, oh, I'm coming here because I'm relationally thirsty. I'm coming here because I have a shit ton of resources to like distribute and I want to know where to send them. Or like, I've got a team that is strategizing around X, Y, and Z. Like knowing that from the get, I think would have facilitated also more clarity for me on how to engage. I can own that from my own perspective. Yeah.
One of the lessons for me from this gathering is, at least the way we've done things so far, people don't do the homework beforehand. So like we thought that we were going to be able to do a bunch of expectation setting before people rolled up, but it just didn't happen. And then because of the way there was that last minute change in the hosting team, we didn't have the presence of mind to kind of adapt and go, hey, people didn't get the expectation setting that we thought was going to happen in the previous weeks. So we've got to do a session now that's going to really get everyone up to the same page. So I really felt that loss too, in retrospect, like when it was too late. But I want to hear more about the community agreement formation. I think normally we would have done something around that. And the reason it didn't happen was like, this like immensely disruptive, like, whoa, everything, all the game's off, like put all the toys down. We're just gonna go into this kind of like, it felt like, I don't know how to describe it, but I felt like I was showing up naked in a way, instead of being like, here's all of my sophisticated tools and tool belts and these are all the things that we have, all of these like facilitation techniques that we'd prepared ahead of time. Like, nope, none of that. We don't have time to do it, or like we don't have the team to distribute that around. We're just gonna do it raw. But in the past, when I've done community agreements, I've always found it quite it's very seldom I've had a good one, put it that way, where it felt like often it feels like we make some nice claims about how it would be good to treat each other. Frequently there's a lot of debate about semantics, and like it's very easy for that just to kind of get feel like a big use of time that it's not actually hitting what it should be hitting, that it's sort of like people get hung up on specific terminology. Or the thing like you're saying about getting people to consider the different impacts that, or like I think you said something about how people have been protected from oppressive systems, like the different way that trying to get people to think about, hey, there's kind of like, this is my words, but I think what you're getting at is there's kind of like different categories of experiences, and just check which category you're in, and then use that as a guide to be like, hey, if you're usually the kind of person that feels like you can speak all the time, this might be a good time to like turn that down a notch. The way I've seen that played in the past, honestly, it's felt like a kind of, what's the phrase for it? Like, basically, there's a kind of fundamentalism, as in I've experienced it as like, here's one way to understand power. It's the correct way, and these are the categories that are important. And there's if you have any doubts about these categories or the way that this is being explained, that's because there's something wrong with you. You're either ignorant or there's something wrong with your morals. And we'll either educate you or we'll kind of give you some accountability until you conform to the standard. And given my history with fundamentalism, growing up in a pretty hardcore church, I'm like so overreactive against any of that I'm like, we can't have any of that. And so I'm like trying to bring in awareness of power dynamics, for example, but just in an unfamiliar way that doesn't presuppose what the conclusion should be, but it's more like a curious exploration, and we're going to learn together. But I completely can see that, like, in the absence of a really effective way of getting people to see domination, if that's not done well, then it's just reinforcing the status quo. And it's just putting the load back on the people who have had the most negative experiences with these oppressive systems in the past. So it's like, it's a risky thing to be experimenting with, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't feel like we really enrolled people in taking that risk. You're like, hey, there you go. I hope you are okay.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, like, you know, so there's some like, you know, one major thing that, you know, systems of harm or systems of oppression do within our relationship is it removes the opportunity for space for negotiating consent. There's an assumption of how things are done. There's assumptions of who can take up space, and there's assumptions that who, like, you know, should be quiet and all that kind of stuff, and like removes a lot of autonomy and agency. So I think if those like conversations are centered around, hey, we're doing this to be in proactively healing relationships with each other. That's the whole purpose of it. Like proactive, because, you know, for any layer that somebody who has held a position of protection or a position of privilege, they're also been harmed by not being able to like live in their full humanity. Like a lot of the byproducts of white bodied supremacy is a disconnection from self and self-awareness, and like not understanding your impact, and like not understanding self. So like that's a form of violence, right? So like by surfacing this kind of stuff, we're offering an opportunity to be in anti-violent relationships with each other and ourselves. It's a renegotiation of like, yeah, it's a renegotiation, which is tricky. It's a very, very tricky business, but very much a problem worth attempting to solve in a group. Because like you said, and I'm so grateful that you said it, like if we don't do it, what we're up against is just like replicating the shit we don't want to replicate.
Yeah. I think there's something in here about the difference between consent and consensus. So like doing as much as we can to support people to be able to, you know, effortlessly and fluidly negotiate consent in a way that just feels easy and joyful, and like, yes, I would like that. No, I would not like that. And that both of those yeses and no's landing with equal enthusiasm, and like no one needs to be like cajoling each other or like pushing people where they don't want to be pushed. Absolutely, all of that. I love that.
Yeah.
And it's something that I try to model personally, you know. And again, like having a more experienced hosting team, we would model that intentionally and quite explicitly, like the way that we disagree with each other or say no to each other's requests and stuff like that. I think the more reactive part that I have is around consensus. So like, for example, one of the lessons that I'm trying to push and as a principle in micro solidarity is like, we actually seldom need consensus. Like what I feel is more lacking in the communities that I'm working in. Like a lot of them are already biased strongly toward consensus. They don't need more consensus. What they need is more like trustful delegation and ways of doing this like temporary dynamic leadership where they get behind someone and say, yeah, we trust you, you got this. And by the way, we're going to give you good feedback at the end so that you improve the next time. And it's not this process of like, the thing that and you probably, I don't know if you noticed, but there was a bunch of times where I actually was like partially triggered. And because I felt like the group was trying to make a consensus on an issue we didn't need consensus on. And I was like interrupting that and saying, nope, nope, we're actually going to trust the individuals to make the right call at the right moment. And we're not going to form a collective agreement on this. And that's a lesson that I found kind of emergently by doing it was something that's important to me, is that like, for example, I don't think we need consensus as a shared agreement about the words that we use for describing the different experiences of how power plays out on people's bodies. Like, I think we can actually have a really generative and peaceful and joyful way of relating, even with people using different epistemologies, you know, that they're coming with different, completely different frames of reference.
Let's describe it rather than define it. Let's describe it rather than define it, for sure.
Yeah. But I think it's another case of me like being a bit reactive against something and dealing with that by like leaving an absence instead of knowing what the creative alternative approach is.
Yeah. I really like this conversation. Very
Why?
much
What is
so.
that? What is that feeling telling you?
Um, a small distraction that I have is that there are 4 concrete things that I want to make sure to at least like just like describe
Mm.
before we go. So I'm also like checking my time because I have a client at 10. I can be a couple minutes late, but at the top of the hour. But what it's bringing up for me is like exactly what you're saying in the sense that, you know, um, when a group desires clarity for a sense of safety and belonging, there is a like hyper specificity that can get needed that I identify out of um, like a survival need to be like seen and understood and to belong. And what you're saying is like it's like the juice behind micro solidarity. We're going to create a big enough space where you know that within that there is a space for you to belong and there's a space for you to find collaboration. And not everybody in this space is going to like 100% align with you. But your job while you're in this space is to find the maximum amount of congealing that is possible and focus on that rather than on the things that are going to separate you.
Mm.
And our survival responses are so good at finding that which separates us because we need to be able to do that to take care of ourselves. But we also needed to be able to take care of ourselves to find what's in common.
Yeah.
And that's the skill that like we're, you know, all of us that are working towards some sort of restorative practice are asking us to like just fucking A, please try to trust what's in common. Like, please try to trust what's in common. Like, please, 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 like to the depth of your being, try to find what's in common. And then like for any part of your wounds that get like hit with some lime juice in the process, like let's make sure that we also as a group have practices to be able to take care of when that hurts. And like one of the organizations that I've been in relationship with for a few years called Holistic Resistance. I don't know if you're checking them at all, but they're out of Victorville, California. And they're a BIPOC-led organization that invests in deep trauma restoration and relationship building as the main tool for anti-racist collaboration and progress.
Mm.
And what they emphasize from the front, and they do this in such a beautiful way, is they're like, you're gonna fucking hurt somebody and you're gonna fucking get hurt. You cannot do this work without like just signing yourself up for getting in the fucking ring, and you're gonna get hurt and you're gonna cause harm because right now we don't know how to not do that because of how fucked up our history is. Like, so how do we go, okay, like that's worth it? And like in a way, you're kind of asking the same thing, like how worth it is it to find what's in common so that we can collaborate with each other?
Mm.
Um,
I think it was Lisa Marie and Jordan hosted a little debrief session with me, which I published, and
oh fuck yes.
I think it was Jordan that said basically that the experience of coming back to the crew every day was like, I'm really building my feeling of belonging, my sense of being heard, my knowledge that these people have got my back in the small scale, and that somehow that feeling of very tight small scale belonging kind of ripples out to the larger group, even though, as you say, we've actually got lots of points of difference. But I can somehow trust you because I know that I've got this comfort zone that I can keep retreating to that resources me to go out into my stretch zone and be like, wow, you really have very different politics from me. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, you're gonna have to rapid fire some points at me, some bullet points.
Yeah, and I save the quicker ones for the end because they're like
Okay,
they're easier. And you know, if they spur further conversation, then you know we're humans and we have Calendlies and we can figure shit out. But two things that I was like, I wanted to create, and I got so distracted because like I was frankly pretty overstimulated throughout the weekend. There was not enough downtime for my nervous system. And it was very hard to figure out how to opt out of the opportunities that were presented. So like small point of direct feedback, like more downtime, please. That was so condensed. But two things that I wanted to create was like a map of geography of where everybody came from, like to actually like visually have it present in front of us, whether somebody could like populate that with some digital support or if we draw it on a whiteboard or whatever. And then also, I don't know if that could be like overlaid or have it be side by side. Another visualization, this comes from like, somehow being able to map the resources that people are coming into the crew with. Whether we could color code that by like, like Ben is like super fiscally connected. Like that man knows how to pull on money, find it, generate it, etc. So like he falls into a certain category. Like, me and Ala, we fall into the category of like facilitation skills and like trauma restoration and like that kind of stuff. And then like some people have like nonprofit organizational skills, like somehow to be able to like really, I mean, the profiles kind of did it, but they weren't necessarily explicitly saying like, these are the resources I'm bringing to Microsolidarity. That would have been really cool to see. And if we can do it like for the whole network, that's be wild and cool.
I'm just thinking about, could there be, this is very multi-dimensional, so I don't know how it's going to work out, but you've got this visual geography of where people come from and where they come from in multiple generations, and therefore what gifts they have to offer. And some kind of like, you can see, because then that whole land acknowledgement piece at the start is like, it's not there's some special people who have a relationship to land. It's like all people have a relationship to land. All of us have lineage. All of us are showing up to something. And what would be the most effortless and joyful thing I could give you? Okay, this is cool.
Yep. I'm a super visual and kinesthetic learner, so like all of those things you're gonna get from me are from those like desires. And then there's a way that our dance crew, so this is a little bit of a jump to a different topic, has navigated COVID safety that I feel like could be of resource to you. Is that especially in the height of shit before vaccinations and like before bodies getting comfortable with it, we would still gather, like we would still gather and dance with each other outdoors. And we would always do an opening circle, and we would do like an opportunity to ask like 3 or 4 different questions that allowed people to state their COVID needs without having to like tell all about them. And like, so we would do something along the lines of like, who for sure needs 6 feet distance? Who for sure needs somebody to pause at 6 feet and like get really explicit consent? Who's like pretty comfortable at 6 feet and like for sure would be like chill with somebody approaching them slowly enough? And then you can like pause at the end of each of those questions and just like scan around the room and be like, cool, I know who my people are. Because I think those boundaries were a little bit tricky to navigate, especially because we're like cohabitating with each other. And that's another moment again of like, do I speak up or do I just isolate and pull away? And so like the raising of hands with quick questions like that, I think could have like probably given a lot more ease for folks to be able to know like, okay, this is my jam. So like,
do you want to hear what I was doing by not doing that?
Sure.
Basically, this was a demonstration of there's a particular kind of leadership in Microsolidarity, which is like, it's my call. I'm going to make the shot. I'm going to tell you what the policy is. I'm telling you how we're going to run it. And I know it's complicated. I know it's painful. I know it's going to cause a lot of upset for a lot of people. And that's how it is. And I know that's like a tense and doesn't immediately feel, I'm guessing it doesn't immediately feel like, oh great, I want to embrace that style of leadership, but that's what I was trying to do there.
I think then maybe explicitly saying that like I am employing a certain kind of leadership.
I did say it on the start of, I can't remember if it was the first morning or the second morning because those got blurred together, but I said about how was it? I was trying to give examples of the kind of leadership I was holding, and one of them was we are doing an open space agenda. There's no negotiation about that. But what goes on the agenda is up to you. And the other one was, I am calling the shots on the COVID policy, and we're not going to figure that out as a group. I named both of them because I knew the second one was going to be spicy for people.
I guess I'm saying, like, I know you did it. I saw you exercise that type of, be like, but to name, and maybe you did this or not, but to be like, I'm practicing a type of leadership. Like, you know, I'm practicing a type of leadership right now that like sometimes can really aid in streamlining shit. Might not be one that you're familiar with. I'm gonna try it out though, because we're doing this experiment thing.
Yeah. And it's going to be gritty, and like let's figure out how to learn from the bumps afterwards.
Yeah.
Which I feel like you're doing. You're closing the loop for me. And what you suggested of like 3 questions, hands up, would have been golden, super easy, would have made a big difference. You've done this before.
Couple times.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know too that I come from the level of sensitivity of working with folks who have experienced the most amount of harm. And so like my facilitation style has had to be that nuanced and that caring, because otherwise folks won't participate. The silence will continue. So like, those kinds of like, just like, this is how it's going to be kind of vibe would only be from like, this is how it's going to be to protect people. Like I can say some shit like that firmly if it's from the like baseline protection shit. Like racism's not gonna fly, y'all. If there's a racist dot in there, we're gonna surface it, we're gonna take care of it, we're gonna love on it, but like not gonna fly. Like that's the kind of totalitarian space that I can hold. You know, but not, it would never come top down. It would be like, I'm holding this bottom baseline of safety. And if you fucking try to break that, like, then you're gonna get my like feet planted, like broad chest, like, yeah.
Right on.
And I'm really appreciative
there's a
of
whole
your
workshop there, right? Like there's a whole workshop there about like what are the things that where you really want to put your foot down in a very assertive way.
Yep. And what comes up when you like try to do that? Can you? Will you? What kind of supports do you need to be able to? Yeah. Well, I really hope this is not the last time that we get to talk. And also super stoked if there's any like projects in the future that you would like to co-genius on. I really like the way that you think through things. And also I was imagining, you know, your partner as your co-brain with you, and just like in this deep craving of like, ooh, I wonder what it'd be like to watch them two together. So I'm also holding that space too of just like deep inquiry, and like I think that's the kind of alchemy that I want to be close to. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm really, I mean, yeah, the way we've been able to hold this conversation, where we're obviously coming from different perspectives, and you're being, I think, really generous, and I think I can hear what you're saying. That's the kind of generative encounter that I'm talking about, you know, the juicy kind of difference. So yeah, I'm good for some kind of next steps. I don't know what they are, but I think it feels like there's micro solidarity energy cooking up in your part of the world. So yeah, I'll keep you in the loop, and let's find a good opportunity to play together.
If you can keep March in mind, we're looking at spring equinox.
Very good.
For like retreat event vibe.
Right. Yeah. Let's talk about that. I'm wondering if you want to answer now, or you could delay till later, but how you would feel about publishing this conversation on the internet, because I think it would be a good demonstration of how a kind of partnership paradigm for how do we give each other feedback.
I guess my curiosity, then I'm wondering if we could like circle back a little bit closer towards the end of the day or tomorrow, and just like letting me know what platforms
Mhm.
and how it would be shared. But I don't have a no. It's more so the how. Yeah.
Right on.
I really liked this conversation too. Mhm.
Nice one. Well, this is a really good end to my day. I hope it's a good start to yours. And good luck with
Yep,
your
yep.
client.
Thank you. Take good care. Much
Thanks,
love.
Morgan. Ciao.